discipline, devoted their lives. During the Middle Ages, the monastic communities held a position of great power in England. This map shows how the monks distributed throughout the country. The principal monastic orders in England were the Benedictines or black monks, the Cistercians or white monks, the Carthusians, and the Augustinian canons. In spite of varying ideas and customs, their daily routine was very similar. Today you may find the ruins of their abbeys and priories throughout the countryside. You may admire the beautiful churches with their graceful pillars and arches. But do you ever wonder what kind of people lived within these walls? How their life was organized? If we look at a plan of the monastery, we must look first at the church. This was built facing towards the east, and the rest of the monastic buildings usually lay on the south side of it, so that the cloisters were comparatively sheltered. The church played the most important part in the life of the monastery. The monk's chief duty was service to God by prayer and singing, and a great deal of his time was spent in the church. The domestic buildings were built around 4 cloisters which formed a quadrangle. To the south lay the refectory or dining room. To the east, the chapter house with the daughter or dormitory above it. The cloisters formed the dwelling place of the community. It was in the north cloister that the monks studied and worked, with the novices nearby in the west cloister. Sometimes a partition or carrel was built where the monks might sit at a desk apart from the others. The refectory lay off the south cloister, and a washing place which the monks used before entering for a meal was built near the door. Towels were kept in a cupboard opposite. The chapter house was also an important building. Here the community met each day to discuss the affairs of the monastery and receive orders from the abbot. The monks sat on a stone bench round the wall, and each had his particular seat. In the daughter or dormitory, the monks slept in one long communal room. In later years, this was divided by partitions, so that each monk had his own cell. On the west side of the cloisters lay the cellarium. Here the stores and provisions of the monastery were kept. It was the cellarer's duty to see that there was adequate food for the monks and any guest who might arrive. The guest house was sometimes built above the cellarium. Today, monasticism is again alive in England, and by studying the daily life of modern monks, we can see how the traditions of medieval monasteries are carried on by them. Early in the morning, the monks rose from their beds and went to the church for the first service of the day. The Opus Dei, or Divine Office, was divided into 8 parts. These were sung at intervals throughout the day.
Et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
matins were sung, followed by lauds and primes. It was the duty of all the monks to attend these services. If any of them had been ill and were not strong enough to take their place in the choir, they could follow the service from a small gallery which adjoined the dormitory. Later, the community met in the chapter house. When they had all assembled, prayers were said, and the abbot or one of the senior monks read a chapter of the rule. Monastic life was founded on the rule of St. Benedict. It laid down the principles which were to guide the community, but the administration of the monastery lay in the hands of the abbot. After the reading, he discussed any affairs within the community. Each monk was allotted certain tasks for the day. Complaints were heard, and faults against the rule were confessed and forgiven. After chapter, the abbot retired to discuss the external affairs of the monastery with his chief officers. The officers were appointed by the abbot himself. The most important of these were the prior, who looked after the spiritual welfare of the monks, and the cantor, who arranged the church services. The upkeep of the church was looked after by the sacrist, who saw that the vestments and service books were kept in good repair. The domestic affairs of the community were divided between the cellarer, whose task it was to buy food and stores from the surrounding countryside, and the kitchener, who supervised the cooking and serving of the meals. Another important officer was the infirmarian, who looked after the monks if they were ill. He usually spent most of his time in the infirmary, which was built apart from the other buildings. During this time, the monks worked in the north cloister, studying and reading, whilst the novices worked apart, learning their lessons with the novice master. The morning's work over, they joined the other monks and went to the refectory for the main meal of the day. As they entered, they rinsed their fingers at the washing place in the cloisters. When they were all assembled, the abbot gave the blessing, and the whole community chanted grace. At the ringing of a bell, the servers brought in the food, and the meal commenced. The monks were not allowed to speak during the meal. One of them read to the community, whilst others acted as servers at the table. Just as the morning was devoted to divine service and to study, so the afternoon was spent in manual work, or in some task concerned with the upkeep of the monastery. A certain number of the monks worked in the gardens or fields. Originally, the whole community worked on the land, but in later years, most of the heavy labor was done by the lay brothers or by hired servants. These lay brothers spent their time in the household, relieving the monks of the domestic work, acting as servants, and working on the land. The community usually owned farmlands close to the monastery, and most of their food was supplied from these farms. Some of the monks took their turn in the kitchens and in helping to prepare the food for the following day. Honey was an important addition to the table in years when sugar was a delicacy only enjoyed by the rich. Indoors, the monks worked in the sacristy, where they cleaned the chalices and laid out the vestments for the priests. Occasionally there was a craftsman in the community, and he might be found making pottery or carving a capital for a pillar in the church. Those who were better suited to intellectual work often spent the afternoon hours in the cloisters or library. Some wrote histories or compiled records, whilst the more artistic made illuminated texts of the Bible and service books. Illumination was a highly developed art and required both skill and patience. The bell was the signal for them to finish their work and go to the church to sing one of the offices. It summoned those working on the farms to leave their labor and return to the monastery. When they returned to the cloister, they washed, ate a light meal, and assembled in the chapter house for a reading. Later, they went again to the church to sing Compline, the last office of the day, and at its end, they retired to bed. But these were not the only activities of the monks. Monastic schools were set up in the early part of the Middle Ages, and although latterly these disappeared, the monasteries maintained a high reputation for scholarship and learning. Very often statesmen and scholars visited the monastery, so that the monks were kept in touch with the changing influences of the world outside. The guest house was open to all travelers, rich and poor alike. In those days, there were few inns, so monastic hospitality became of great importance. The guest master received the guests and provided them with food and a bed for the night. If the travelers were destitute, they were cared for by the almoner. It was the duty of the almoner to visit the poor and the sick and to help them if they were in need. Money and food was provided by the monastery for this purpose. You can see that in these ways the monks were brought into contact with the outside world. Often the monasteries became very rich and had a great deal of influence amongst the people. In later years this power was abused, and finally, in 1539, the monasteries were dissolved by order of the king. But in spite of the dissolution, much remains to us of their life and work. Almost all the historical records we have of early English history were either written or preserved in monasteries in this country, and these valuable manuscripts show us the wealth of culture and learning among the monks. The Lindisfarne Gospels, for instance, are a very early and unique example of illumination of the Bible. The History of England by Matthew Paris provides a much later example of the histories written by an outstanding scholar of the Middle Ages. Above all, the churches and cathedrals throughout the country serve as the most enduring memorial to their work. The stained glass which enriches some of our cathedrals is a legacy of the past, and their influence was not a material one only. Amongst their members were men who kept alive the spirit of service and good works, and who preserved the great ideals of Christianity amidst the struggle and darkness of the Middle Ages.